I'm not too bad. Enjoying the -9 degrees at night at the moment, and it didn't go above zero today, I don't think. But I'm enjoying the cold weather, which is a good sign.
It was 5 degrees a few days ago, and I was like, man, it's cold outside.
I bet for Mexico, it doesn't. Does it ever snow in Mexico? Probably not.
I looked up for San Miguel de Allende. It had a record of snowing at some point, but I don't think it snowed recently, maybe in the last 5 or 10 years.
It's probably when the asteroid hit. Yeah, there probably.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, I've been starting all the streams since Ray passed. With I mean, I think I said this the last stream, but I think of you as like an original Ray person. It was like Emma Sarakis, myself, Rob Turner, and a few of us were talking about Ray maybe in like 2000, even maybe 2000. Dude, my timeline is all mixed up. I think it's like 2010 or 2011.
Yeah, I think around about there. Yeah, that's certainly. I think. Yeah, 2009, 2010 maybe. But again, I didn't really kind of go into it till 11, 12, started going into it properly with any depth.
12 seemed like a big year. Like I remember that picking up and people getting more into him, and people asking for interviews and things like that. But it seems like a lifetime ago to think back to them.
Yeah, and so much time has passed, and obviously so much has passed, so much has happened in all that time as well. I just, obviously recently with Ray passing, I was actually in Belgium, just about to sit down for a meal after a couple of Belgian beers with a friend in Bruges, and I kind of went, "Oh my God, Ray's died." He's like, "Who's Ray?" I'm like, just like. He tried to explain to someone that's not in this kind of field of work, it's kind of difficult. But it's like someone who has such a big pull on my life to be in the trajectory where I am now. And I wouldn't be kind of even thinking about that stuff if it wasn't after a metabolic typing course where the instructor said, "You should really check out this guy, Ray Peat."
Well, we're connected forever, I think, because you were the one that told me that it happened. I checked my Instagram. And I had saw that message from you. I can't even remember what you said, but you're like, "I'm sorry for sorry for the loss" or something. I was like, I knew something instantaneously, like my heart sunk, and I was like, man, I know something bad has happened. And because that we talked about it in the stream, but those 2 months leading up to that day, it seemed off. Like people were emailing me saying, "Hey, I communicate with Ray every single week, and he's not returning any of my emails," and I was like. It's kind of normal for him not to return my emails, but I was like, these other people, that must be a problem. And so, yeah, dude, that was brutal, really hard.
I think it was really, I mean, I'd sent something and I'd emailed Eric a couple of times and I said, "Have you heard from Ray? He's not done." It was weird because I'd usually check out his call in with Patrick Timponi, and he hadn't done one for a couple of months. And that, for me, that was like, something's not right. And it was really weird because that week, right up until the Thursday, when I kind of saw something, I was feeling so off, so sad. I even said to my wife, I said, "Is there something up between us at the moment that I don't know about? I can't put it on." She's like, "No, you're kind of imagining things." That's just, I feel so off. And lo and behold, something had happened, and it was kind of weird to experience that, and I guess not so weird in the cosmological kind of sense, but I think it's a big loss, and I do think that. And, you've seen a couple of people kind of jump on and say, "Oh, he's no," I think it's Garrett Smith already going, "I feel vitamin A toxicity." And, it's like, yeah, dude, if you disagree with them, choose your timing. It's like, it kind of shows a lot about the person when you're kind of jumping on someone's bandwagon straight away and saying that.
Yeah. If you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. I don't like that guy at all.
Yeah. And I just think it's still, I mean, for those who've been reading him for a while and kind of taken the time to understand his work, will kind of realize that his kind of words will live on longer than us, probably.
Yeah, there was a caller, he's a buddy of mine named Joey, and he said if there is a silver lining in all this stuff, it's that Ray could become way bigger in death than he ever was in life. And it's crazy because he was like already a living legend, like he's already kind of this mysterious guy, in Eugene, Oregon. and now that he's passed away, I mean, you can already feel it. Like the week after, it already seems like there's a level of interest that wasn't there before. And so,
right.
But I guess with that becomes the possibility that his work is heavily diluted in some way. And so, I mean, I guess there's a good and bad to that. And so I guess that puts the responsibility on everyone because people were telling me on calls like, "Oh, you and Georgie are now the guys." And I don't think of it like that at all. It's like the responsibility is dispersed through all of us to keep the to keep the succinct message alive, you know. And it's not
Yeah.
like one person has become Ray, because that's impossible, you know.
Yeah, I think it's a collective, isn't it? There's so many people who kind of have an idea about what he said, and I think there is probably still lots of holes to fill, and I hopefully kind of trying to do the best that I can with what I'm doing. But we'll see what happens. Ask me in 5.5 years.
Yeah. Well, let's reminisce a little bit. What remember 2012 and Facebook, and what was that? Do you remember that time? What was that like for you?
It was really interesting because I was still in that kind of holistic model, you know, the Czech Institute, sugar is bad, there are 4 white devils, you know, sugar, salt, flour, milk, you mustn't consume them. There was still a tail end of that. I was still trying hard to shake that off around about 2011 and 12. And, you know, even the sugar issues, it was still, okay, am I doing the right thing here? Is this kind of, and then it was just kind of, it drew you into the complexity of biology. And I think it was a good place to be because it felt like you were starting from scratch again, and you were just trying to, you know, rub away all the kind of deep grooves that certain types of education had left in you. And there was still obviously the mainstream medical stuff going, you still had doctors going, you shouldn't eat fruit because it would cause diabetes. And if you have diabetes, you shouldn't eat fruit. So it was quite good to be at that stage where you almost felt like you were starting again in biology. And I think when you went back and looked at some of the basics, you went, oh yeah, of course, that makes perfect sense. And then it was kind of like learning some of or not learning, but going away and reading some of the references that Ray was talking about. You know, I was exposed to St. Georgie for the first time, Gilbert Ling, Hans Selye, not so much because everyone was talking about the gas response before. Yeah. But, you know, even the older researchers like Walter Cannon, and then Lamarck. And I kind of been reading some really good stuff on Lamarck, which I kind of, for me, when you start looking at Lamarckian problematics, I think it kind of really hits the nail on the head. And then you can start to kind of entwine Darwin's ideas. And Ray was the first person to mesh all of these amazing references together, whether it's Katharina Dalton, who's influenced my work with working with clients so much, and yours as well, no doubt. And, you know, all of these other people, and just reading his books. And I've actually sat down for the new year to read all of his books again, just to go through them, because there's always a gem that I've missed. And somebody, I remember, you know, just a few years back going, somebody put something and they'd only just picked up Ray. I went, I never got that the first time. It just didn't appear to me because I was so focused on something else like thyroid or sugar or something. And there are these gems to get out there. And I think anybody who's not, you know, unfortunately got to read his newsletters in the past, I don't think they really understood what Ray was about, because they didn't see the level of complexity he was drawing on. Sure, there were the ones that are on the website, and they appealed to a few of the, you know, general topics of the time: dairy, sugar, estrogen as well. And I just think it was great how he brought all of that together and made it accessible for a lot of people. And that's where I think 2012 was for me. And I think, you know, those years afterwards, and, you know, I think, you know, like you said Rob Turner, I think Eric Lepine, obviously, a big force in kind of getting his getting his information out there understood reasonably well when people were going, oh, but he says this. And then Eric would go, right, he'd combine everything really succinctly and go, well, there's that information, go and look at that. And I think he did a great job when he was on Facebook of kind of providing some congruence and cohesion around his ideas.
Yeah, you remember Cliff McCrary? He was like the surfer dude, young guy. Like I owe a lot to him, and then Karen MCC as well. Like, because I didn't understand almost anything Ray was saying philosophy wise, and they broke it down for me in a way that I would have never understood. But yeah, Eric Lepine, Rob Turner, Emma Sarakis, probably people in like 30 people Facebook groups. I remember really spoon feeding me and helping me understand even the tiniest details about, like, I didn't even know what like glycolysis was. Like when I got into it, I was like, what is Ray talking? Like, what is this? I was like, oh man, you're gonna have to learn things that you find to be really difficult and hard to understand. And it was really painful. But yeah. And then one other question, what with the sugar stuff, what was your like trigger, or what was the thing that made you think that he was onto something?
I think really kind of the ideas around diabetes and perhaps potentially overfeeding sometimes to get sugar into the system. I found that really interesting. And the idea that there wasn't enough sugar going into the cell. And I think when you started going back and then looking at some of the mechanisms about, for me now, and looking at some of the research that I'm looking at, it makes perfect sense that when energy is not flowing through a system, you're going to see glucose being elevated. And again, it's like you see lots of people. I mean, I think it's almost like just like Francis Crick's dogma about DNA flowing to RNA. I think the low carb ketos kind of dogma is cholesterol values don't matter, but blood glucose levels do matter.
Yeah,
and it's like, well, you can't, it's not a one-way street. You kind of have to kind of look at everything that kind of drives that response. And I think when you start looking at what interrupts glucose physiology and stops it being used, I think that's where you're onto something. But everyone keeps going around the symptom chasing. Okay, we've got to get glucose down. Well, if you stop eating glucose, your values are going to go down, because on a keto diet or on a low carb diet, then. And it's like, yeah, but not for everybody, they're not going to respond beneficially, and they're not going to restore that pathway. So you come back to eat carbs again, and oh my God, your glucose levels are going up and you're starting to feel crap because you can't process it. I mean, it's like, they were the main things that got me thinking about, well, how do you restore glucose use? Not just keep focusing on the idea that glucose is elevated. Look at the pathways that are broken down, look at the loss of pyruvate, look at the elevations of lactate. Where do these problems get interrupted, and how can we solve them? And I think, looking at some of the endocrine disruptors, I mean, I've looked at hundreds of papers over the last couple of years. In fact, probably over the last year alone, I've looked at hundreds of papers of specific endocrine disruptors and how they disrupt glucose physiology, and how they disrupt, most importantly, thyroid physiology. And, why these kind of, what Ray always talks about, why the TSH test is it can be completely useless. And even, in a bunch of other tests, it can still be completely useless, just because there are so many blocking mechanisms of TSH and, rerouting mechanisms, and, even altering of set points that can occur when there's gestational exposure of these environmental pollutants. So I like the idea of not looking at that symptom of high glucose, which still so many people look at.
Yeah, like a holistic picture of not just looking at one variable. And like, for example, what you said, the TSH can be low or it can be high, and a person can have hypothyroidism. And maybe taking those old markers like the pulse and temperature is possibly even more meaningful than these interpretations of lab work.
Yeah, and I think you still kind of have to explain to everyone, they're crude, but they're very, very useful, because yes, there are in the same mechanism that temperature can be masked by certain stressors. You can usually see that change when you implement dietary strategies, and perhaps and that's something you're going to see relatively quickly. Those changes are going to usually occur if that's the right mechanism. But with TSH, it can still take potentially years, to come up to where it should be, into that kind of Frank-overt state. And this is why, I think those researchers like Barry Durrant-Peatfield and David Derry were spot on. And yet they still paid the ultimate price for kind of using their brain.
You had said something earlier about the, I remember being low carb or possibly even carnivore, and somebody had sent like maybe they put a reference on their blog that said, high levels of non-esterified free fatty acids are elevated long before hyperglycemia ever becomes present. And I was like, what? Like I couldn't understand that at all until I got into race stuff. And I was like, oh, it's like the free fatty acids are blocking the use of glucose, and the stress systems are liberating the free fatty acids. Therefore, you should increase your thyroid function if you're worried about this like high blood sugar. So okay, so what do you think are some? You want to talk about your work? You want to go into? People really wanted us to talk about thyroid stuff, but I do want to talk about pollution. I want to talk about what you're doing in the lab right now.
Sure.
Yeah. Floor is yours on the subject.
Well, absolutely. I'm the rookie in the lab. I'm probably the oldest person in the lab by the professors. Most of my PhD colleagues are kind of half my age and looking at oscillations in cancer, oscillations in calcium physiology, and cancer and things like this. And I kind of walked in, and the only person that's looking at thyroid. I have a colleague who's from Thailand who's looking at estrogen receptors as well. So we're kind of working together. But I've never, all these guys have done masters and stuff where they've been in the lab, and I'm literally like, I've just been going in the lab. I've been making kind of cerebral spinal fluid, doing mouse sacrifices and dissections, taking the brain into certain slices and, keeping it kind of functional with like certain chemicals like RNA later, so we can read the RNA as it comes out later. So I'm in the lab again tomorrow. I've been asked to take liver slices and dissect and store these up for future use. And it's like, yeah, sure, I can do that. I've only been shown once, but yeah, I'll be fine with that. And it's quite interesting. I quite like the fact, I think I posted about it as well, is like, I'm just making artificial cerebrospinal fluid. That the main components, apart from water in that, are vitamin C, glucose, and sodium chloride. I can't see a fatty acid in there. It's like we want to keep the brain alive and take it out of shock. Not alive, but take it out of shock, so it's kind of still left, so it's able to be read and being used for slices. So we've been doing that, and next I kind of start on the cell line. Last year, I've really been looking at a meta-analysis over the effects of certain pollutants, and one thing we found was that brominated flame retardants have a real interesting effect on thyroid physiology. The older kind of pollutants, like the decas and the penta brominated flame retardants, like your BDEs, they're persistent and they've been banned, but they're around in the environment still. There's so much of them still around. And what's interesting about those is they have an effect on the thyroid receptor. They have a very similar ligand binding, so they can bind into the receptor and block the receptor from functioning properly. You still get your genomic effects, your kind of metabolic effects or heat effects from T3 as an example. But these flame retardants are quite interesting. And so what I'm dialing down on is a specific flame retardant to look at to see how it disrupts it. So we're going to be looking at applying this and hopefully looking how a T4 or T3 combo compares to a T4. Now, what's interesting about the newer flame retardants, DB, DPE, they were said that they were non-toxic and weren't causing problems, which is like what they all do with everything, right? Yeah, you can apply that to the kind of mass formation psychosis that's gone over the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Safe and effective doesn't do anything. And then the same with big industry and flame retardants as an example, is that these flame retardants, they might not have the same molecular binding because they don't have a hydroxyl bond and they don't affect the binding domain as such. But what they have been found to do is to kind of disrupt thyroid physiology around the axis, but also seem to have a very strong cardiovascular effect where it will cause endothelial damage. It will cause the thyroid receptors to be increased and decreased. It will kind of appear to have this kind of thyroid effect over time. So the idea is perhaps to look at those. There is some interesting stuff where they've done it in C. elegans, and it's shown that they've almost induced like an Alzheimer's-like state. They've affected kind of, obviously when you're assessing C. elegans, the movement is very different to humans. So you're making a very large jump by saying that the movement is affected, but the head thrash test, the wave cycles of the worms, they're distinctly changed compared to, say, what you would see normally. And the other thing is it seems to cause like a deposition of increased beta amyloid. So those folded proteins will kind of oligomerize and cause their aggregate in the brain and kind of be associated with this lack of glucose use in the brain. And also it decreases the amount of transthyretin. So as we know, transthyretin is a potent carrier. It's a second main largest carrier of thyroid, and particularly in the human brain. The relevance being between rats and humans, or rodents and humans, that it's the main thyroid carrier. So there's certainly some carryover from that mammalian physiology. So that's kind of the stuff I've been looking at. We've just been dialing into which one we're going to validate for the study. And the other thing I've been looking at recently as well is what happens, because a lot of these studies, they look at very specific endocrine disruptors and how it disrupts the thyroid. But they don't really combine it with other kind of nefarious stuff. So I thought, well, what happens if we could get like something like a pesticide and combine that with a brominated flame retardant? Because that could be quite interesting. And if you look at glyphosate, it's got quite interesting thyroid disrupting characteristics. It can affect thyroid physiology. It can affect what's going on in the brain. It seems to induce osteoporosis in rodents. So there's certainly some bone morphology issues there. And it certainly seems to kind of perhaps lend itself to the breakdown of glucose use as well. So what happens if you combine two of those at a low dose? That could be quite interesting to look at. And does it make them hypothyroid? And can you resolve that? Unfortunately, what we've got to start looking at doing is how many groups of subjects can we look to do that in? Because otherwise it gets quite complicated. So I'm going to have to be quite specific. And I think the interesting stuff about glyphosate is it seems to disrupt iodine physiology. So iodine, it's a zwitterion, so it tends to have a kind of positive and neutral kind of ion charge. And what happens is that's relatively new. It tends to be relatively neutral, but at different pHs, it seems to combine with these kind of minerals and metals. So one thing it might be doing is stopping iodide uptake or combining with iodine and glyphosate, becoming an iodine and a glyphosate. Now, what they don't know in the studies yet is whether that's just kind of evacuated out by, detoxification pathways, or it goes up to the thyroid gland as iodine glyphosate. And we know that kind of thyroid cancers are heavily increasing. They're very common. Interestingly, zipping back to the brominated flame retardants, there are some studies where they've got thyroid cancer patients and they've got them to wear kind of these wristbands at the house. And one of the most common thing that they found from dust and touching stuff in the house is that brominated flame retardants are very dominant on these wristbands. So it could be that the kind of pollutants that you get in home, particularly in your standard home, there's flame retardants everywhere. Could the ingestion or the inhalation of these compounds be associated or even causative in the increases in thyroid cancer? So I think that's quite interesting. I'm not too sure yet if the glyphosate, maybe there might be a need to increase more iodine. That could be something that could bypass that. Equally, increasing more thyroid hormone would be a useful strategy as well. So they're the kind of things I'm looking at. It's been interesting because I'm a statistically illiterate person, but I'm getting there. I hate it. I spoke to Eric as well. He said, God, I hate statistics as well. And I said, yeah, I do too, but I kind of need to have this to get through this. So I have been having some coaching with a friend who was helping me out, and she's kind of helped me to get through there. And I'm kind of getting there. The meta-analysis is going to be started. I've got to write up a report next year, which we'll see if that might get published. We'll see. But I've got a bit of work to do for that yet. And then starting the cell lines and then move on to rodents in the next year or two.
That's amazing. You answered some of the questions I was going to ask you, but I mean, when you're talking to somebody, you ever suspect like their bed is making them sick, or their sheets or their couch and things like that? I mean, that's really often not talked about, that could be a potential aggravating factor for hypothyroidism or just general inflammation.
Yeah, I don't think some of the environmental stuff, and doctors aren't interested in that. You've got your symptom, you've got the disease, they want to treat it. There's never any kind of it's always reactive medicine, isn't it? There's no proactive stuff. And this is where people kind of get interested in kind of the health sphere about what can they do. And then they go the other end and go totally mental about it. And it's like, what can I control? I have to control everything. Yeah. Nothing bad is getting through. And it just doesn't, sometimes you end up with partial neurosis, which is, I think, what everybody had when they were doing low carb initially.
That's why I push back on that and try to surround myself with as much EMF as possible. So that's what I'm doing here.
Yeah, well, that's okay. I think, well, you can always buy into the hormesis, right? And it does become unavoidable. And I think when you get all those things converging, whether it's EMF, air pollution, food pollution, it becomes impossible. You can't control everything, but I think there are certain things that you can do. I mean, we don't have a friendly bed. We got one recently. We just moved home and bought a new house, and the cost of the house, everything else. And I think I got some kind of poisoning because we had carpets that had been in 20 years with kind of rotten rubber underneath, which was kind of probably all covered in BFRs, and kind of there are points in your life where you're going to have to deal with this, and sometimes you will get sick. But if you're in the right place and know what to do, I think you can kind of rebound back. But yeah, I don't think there was enough paid on that. It was just, and life for consumption is usually surrounded by all of these things that are cheap and easy to make. And whether it's kind of Christmas toys coming up or, furniture, I think there are things you can do, buying leather sofas as an example, but still inside of that, you are going to have treated kind of soft stuff and lining and things. So I think it's kind of trying to be pragmatic and relatively realistic, and almost going back. One thing I did learn from the Czech Institute was that 80-20 rule. If you're kind of doing 80% of the time right, you can get away with 20. And I think that's a reasonable kind of thing to abide by.
I was actually looking to get a carpet in this space just to deaden the sound on the floor. And I think a normal carpet would have been like $400, like a good one. And the one that was organic and had no chemical flame retardants was, I think, $2,000. And so I was like, oh my God, this is so expensive to purchase this stuff. But, would a good rule of thumb be that if you could smell it or something was like off-putting about the smell, do you think that would be like a good test to say, hey, maybe I need to do something about this couch?
Yeah. Do you know what? Do you remember there's a really good blood chemistry book out called CBC Analysis by Dick and Weatherby?
I might have it. Yeah, I might have it in my notes.
Yeah. I think it's one of the first books I started out with blood tests. And I started doing his functional medicine course back in, 2008, 2009 or something. And he had on this one video, this one thing that stuck out. It said, if you can smell it, it's already in your bloodstream. Yeah. And I think that's a good thing. If it's like getting into a new car that's overpowering the plastic. So I'd always buy a secondhand car and never buy a brand new one. I think it's like, I think it's very, very relevant. Obviously, the particles become very, very small at that level. But again, if it's like a convergence of all of these things, and then it's in a physiology that's kind of at a breaking point, I think it's very, very relevant. And like I said, the carpets, we put wooden floors downstairs, and we got carpets upstairs, and we went for like 80% wool, because the difference is like between the 100% wool and then you got the standard carpets which have no wool in as well. So you compromise on things that you're able to compromise on. So yeah, I think the smelling thing, before I digress too much, is very relevant.
Last question about this: what have you messed around with negative ion generators at all? Years ago, I asked Ray about the best air filter for the room, and he sent me a link to Mystic Marvel's negative ion generator. That guy doesn't make them anymore, but there's a company called Wein, WEIN, that makes them. And right. So, but the reports from a lot of people, and in my own experience, if a room smells bad, you can put one in it, and it will basically change the smell of the room completely. It's really, really,
really wow. Yeah, that's quite good. Yeah, I mean, we kind of just had to rip carpets out because there was a smell. Just get rid of it and air the room out. But yeah, I think air. I was just consulting with someone in Dallas yesterday. And said, the things I said, well, you're living in a polluted area. One of the easiest things that you can do is your home is a cocoon. That's where you regenerate when you're kind of coming home to sleep and stuff. So make sure that your home is that you can do enough. And I think the air quality, water filter, not going too mad on your kind of, high brominated flame retardant things, and, reducing that smell. They're all relevant for sure.
Awesome. Okay. We can talk more about your work in the laboratory because it's very interesting and a personal experience, or I can barrage you with thyroid questions, or what?
Yeah, whatever. I mean, any of those. I think also, do you know what? Something that's really interesting as well that I've kind of seen is that, or looking at the research, and I think it always comes back to Ray's ideas on PUFA and omega-3s, is the idea of pyroptosis induced by omega-3s. And I was looking at some research the other day about pyroptosis, and if you look at it in the papers, that all the ones that flag up underneath, it was like cadmium-induced pyroptosis, lead-induced pyroptosis, and then omega-3s kind of pitched slightly differently. Omega-3 enhanced pyroptosis enhances chemotherapy to get better outcomes, and I still think I think that thing of what I think that's still going to be very, very relevant is that small excess of omega-3 is good. It can be disastrous. I think for the cell in the long term. And I think the ideas about pyroptosis and how this kind of inflammasome or kind of high inflammation mediated cell death that's not particularly friendly, it's just like it's degradation of the cell, it's almost like cell necrosis, is enhanced when there are high levels of pollutants like the metals, for example. And I think you start to see this breakdown in I think it's induced by caspase, which would kind of be the signaling molecule. There are other kind of things like nod-like, I think they're called nod-like protein receptors, which initiate caspase, which basically break down the cell for destruction, not in the beneficial way like apoptosis does, and how it's kind of like, the ongoing process of autophagy that is thyroid mediated. I think when you start to get, and some of the researchers have pitched it as omega-3s have been touted as these wonderful molecules that are going to help to kind of cure, but there is a very easily achieved point of damage that can be occurred here. And I think that's quite interesting to kind of keep looking at that, because again, I think omega-3s are still touted as this wonder nutrient that everybody should be taking. And I still think that, their influence on the thyroid gland, potentially throwing T4 off the thyroid carriers. I think this is quite useful to keep considering. So yeah, I just wanted to thought that might be interesting.
I'm a little bit of a dummy. Is pyroptosis different than apoptosis? But apoptosis is altruistic suicide, right? So what's the difference between the two?
So it's mediated by very high levels of inflammation, where the cell ends up not being able to control that well. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that it goes that way, and increased pyroptosis is potentially very damaging, mm-hmm. whereas apoptosis tends to be relatively organized and coherent. And I think...
got it. It's uncontrolled cell death, right?
Yes, yeah,
got it.
And that can be kind of... It depends. There could be a level of that where it's quite useful, but at the same time, it tends to be unrestrained and tends to go overboard very quickly.
Wasn't the characteristic of that it's causing inflammation to neighboring cells, like the release of ATP and iron and all the cell guts is causing inflammation in the vicinity of the cell?
Yeah, I think it could always be like, you'll probably see it in advanced states of sepsis as well. So you'll see lots of damage, you'll see lots of byproducts, you'll see lots of bystander kind of events going on where other tissues are damaged as well. And I think it would depend on how much is there. But it's a bit like, I think, the use of where they're using omega-3s to induce this pyroptosis. It's like literally you're making the cell leakier. Yeah. You're putting big holes in the cell, causing it to leak. And everyone would go, well, membrane fluidity. And it's like, no, not membrane fluidity. It's a leaky cell. Yeah. And you're basically making it leakier. So the chemotherapy can flow into the cell and damage it further. So it's like it's basically just outflanking, the cancer cell with a two-pronged approach. So I think it can be quite damaging.
Were you on the receiving end of anybody telling you they're taking cod liver oil now? And what do you think about it?
I try not to get involved in all that stuff. I mean, there's so many people.
Or more of your clients, like did you have to talk anybody off a ledge or anything?
I know. some people say, well, if you want to take cod liver oil, take it in small doses. Make sure you're getting your vitamin E in. So it's not something I recommend, but kind of people you usually see people coming in with a list of supplements, and who they're following.
Yeah, I agree.
it's quite easy. And I'm trying not to fall into that trap with supplements that I sell, because I don't really advertise my supplements apart from a bit on the Instagram page and stuff. If you want it, get it. And it's like, it's the same with kind of my clients. They say, where can I get them from? I said, well, I sell them, but I don't care if you buy them from me. You can get them from anywhere you want. But I think that the argument around cod liver oil, it's kind of people keep changing their minds on things. I still think caution is mediated on those.
Well, like we're kind of talking about here, it's good to have a foundation. Like when I was religious, my pastor used to say, Danny, if you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything. And I kind of think about that in the terms of the health world. If you don't have a solid foundation for what makes a person healthy or what makes a person sick, you're just kind of like a bag in the wind, and you're just like blowing from like idea to idea. And it's a bad place to be, especially as a consumer, because you'll end up spending $70 on a cod liver oil bottle here and $80 on something here. And it's just, I think one of the things I appreciate about Ray so much is he has like this non-elitist view of health, and where some pasteurized milk in an egg and some orange juice could improve a person's health, and it would cost $6 or something. So, yeah. I think that's great. And it's, you still get so many people going, everything I eat is organic, it's raw milk. It's like, that's fine. And if it's working for you, great. But, you don't always have to kind of have that approach. Yeah. And you're right. It was very refreshing. One other thing that you said, you're probably actually doing a service to people in Europe, because whenever I talk to people, I'm like, oh yeah, you'll have to import it from the US. And if you want to buy B1 or something like that. So, I mean, it's probably just logistically more, you're making things that are available that are hard to obtain, right?
I'm not sure how hard they are to obtain. I've got a supplement provider who've got a really good reputation, and I kind of went to them. Although they kind of cocked up my last order. I wanted to try and organize a high dose thiamine, and I got 150 bottles of something that wasn't that high dose. So we're working on the higher dose one now. But it's good quality stuff. And what I've tried to do is be kind of not go too much. And what drives me mental is seeing people, they buy little capsules of, like, when I first started looking at theanine, for an example, I got it and it was in a capsule, and you got like 40 grams and it was like 20 quid. And I think get it in pouch form so people can buy as much as they can, and it's relatively cheap compared to everybody else. And I think a lot of the supplements should be cheap and economical for people, and I don't think people should be spending an arm and a leg. So I just want to provide supplements that are kind of accessible and don't break the bank, to be honest, and a good quality. And I think that's what you need to offer people. Sure, you can get people that want to make a huge killing from supplements, but I'm not in it for that, to be honest. And I had to do that because I realized that taking 6 years of my life off and giving 50% of my week to do this PhD is, I just don't have as much time as I used to have to do consults or even just roll out new material anymore. I'm kind of strangled for time.
I feel like that when I'm taking care of the chickens. I'm like, I have no time for anything now.
Right, maybe chickens next year wouldn't be a good idea.
That's amazing. You're one of the only people I believe when you say that about the supplement stuff. But we can move on after this. But what were some of the pitfalls? Was it hard for your vision of like a B vitamin supplement? Was it really hard to make that come to fruition, where you're like, no, you can't do this, or you have to make it this way? Like, what was that, just a rat's nest?
No, I just wanted to look at what was reasonably absorbable, and what was in the physiology that showed that it was kind of generally the most common forms of being uptaken. I looked at some of the synthetic stuff that's made in the States, and actually we can't make it over here. It's like benfotiamine as an example. Just can't. You're not allowed to use that. So I looked at something like thyrine pyrophosphate, which is easily absorbed and very well tolerated. And I just went for simple things that I didn't have to kind of really spend months and years of research doing to get this kind of on a pedestal supplement that's bathed in gold. I just wanted basic stuff that we could use and turn around quickly. And like the B complex without the B12, for example, it was just like going to a company that made really good ones and say, I want this without a B12, and it was easily made. I still get a lot of people going, it's got citric acid in it. I said, yeah, it has, but it's like it's a small amount and it's unlikely to cause you any problems, and if it does, you can stop it. It's like, it's really that simple. Well, so
go ahead.
Sorry, go on.
You go.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so there are kind of things to that sometimes it can be sometimes you're striving for this perfect supplement, and you can get good clean supplements like the theanines and the taurines. They're just clean supplements that don't have anything in at all in a pouch. And sometimes when you've got stabilization issues, I looked at a magnesium supplement with a B vitamin, and I just couldn't get it to hold because the magnesium was like not staying stable and causing the riboflavin to react, and it was just impossible to get that together. So I tried some things, they didn't work, and then I just kind of got to the idea of I can keep trying to find something that's really novel and stuff. And I think to stick to the basics, what are the things I've looked at with clients? What are the things that I can do to improve liver function, hormone function, and stick with those things, to be honest.
Man, it's too easy to talk to you. I think it's been 40 minutes already. So people have really been requesting that we talk about thyroid. So I think you and I are on the same page that thyroid is this really useful supplement. It demands a person's attention. It's not necessarily, it can be hard to implement, I always recommend reading Hypothyroidism to Unsuspected Illness by Britta Barnes. Like, the more information a person has going into it, usually the better the outcome is. And so I think we align on this, that it's a very valuable supplement in 2022 when we're barrage with chronic, nonstop, intense psychological stress and physiological stress as well. So what, your thoughts, December 15th, 2022, and we're not doctors, we're just lay people talking about a hypothetical approach to using thyroid. But what would to a hypothetical person or yourself, how do you think about thyroid supplementation at this moment?
I still think, and I stand by probably what we said, I think almost this time last year, I think it was, is that the dangers of thyroid are vastly overstated. When you look at any of the research, whether it it's, people still talk, and I think Ray talks about this, how people, say that, too much thyroid hormone will cause your bone to leach calcium. It's like, yes, that's hyperthyroidism. And when you're not getting enough nutrients in, that will be the problem. Mm-hmm. And again, it's like when people go hyperthyroid, if you get someone who's truly hyper and you give them enough nutrients, the negative effects of hyperthyroidism aren't that bad, because you keep the calorie maintained, you keep calcium going in, you're able to kind of deal with that high energy state. But to get to that state from supplementation, I think is quite hard unless you dive in at a silly amount. And, that's still why some cardiovascular surgeons think it's prudent to prescribe T3 after a coronary artery bypass graft, because you want to enhance oxidation rather than glycolysis and produce loads of lactate and cause necrotic cell death. So I think thyroid supplementation is very, very safe. The only danger is if you're at immediate risk of a heart attack and you've dived in with 3 or 4 grains, you're probably going to have a problem. Yeah. If you're starting with that very, very prudent low dose of, say, a quarter, generally I'd start with a half a grain anyway, or something like that, and go up slowly. I mean, depending on the person, if I've got someone who's a bit older, I'll start with a quarter of a grain and go upwards. And I think they're obviously hypothetical people. And so I think it's very kind of useful to understand that from a complexity perspective, maintaining thyroid is still one of the most intelligent things to do. I still think the idea that that some of the research where people are looking at, say, centenarians and say, well, they have higher TSH values. And it's like, yeah, because all the other people who you've tried to look at have died. It's like maybe their TSH is also increasing because their thyroid is ultimately failing. Mm-hmm. You can't just say that, that TSH values are predictive of centenarians. And actually, some of the research suggests actually they have higher T3 values than people that aren't centenarians. So I still think there's a lot of work and research and discussion to be had around thyroid hormone. And you still see that there are very large communities. I haven't looked at this, I've raised like Thyroid UK or, the big communities that talk about stuff. I don't even ever come across Paul Robinson's stuff. He writes some good blogs around, why T3 therapy can be a really good place for most people to be in without even taking T4 sometimes. And he's written some really good stuff on that and some really good rebuttals to the ideas that, T4 and T3 shouldn't be used together, and still the mainstream medicine that levothyroxine is the gold standard, which is not. And if you look at the research, you look at it properly, it won't take you long to come up with the ideas that actually levothyroxine fails a lot of people.
I'm sure you've come across this, but something that's happened, maybe it's because I've been talking to more people, but a lot of people have said, hey, I took a small amount of T3 or a small 1 to 3 mixture of T3 and T4, and I had an extreme adrenaline reaction. And so do you have an approach or do you have something you say to people that experience that?
Well, I think sometimes timing. So some people might take that on an empty stomach, and some people might do better if they have it with food and get the absorption down. I think just making sure that you have adequate nutrients, adequate carbs, and that can usually avoid that. Sometimes people are extremely sensitive. I think sometimes some of the problems boils down to the state of the GI system. It might be that, and it's hard to say whether if you've got more of a damage, whether that might go in quicker or whether it might go in slower. It's really hard to tell, but the state of other systems might dictate that. Some people have more adrenal reserve than others. Some people don't. But I think sticking to the basics of getting adequate light, making sure you've got adequate sodium, all of these things will add up and usually prevent that. And then you've also got the very basic tenets that some people might take it and not need it.
Yep.
And I think, looking at your temperature and pulse is generally it's a reasonable indicator to give you an idea of whether you need it or not. And then there are the confounders that you need working through.
And then are you an advocate of getting people to maybe take their have you ever experienced somebody taking thyroid, having a bad experience, getting their cholesterol measured and it was too low? And maybe they already had low cholesterol, and then they're taking thyroid, it's lowering it even more and it's making them feel terrible.
Yeah, I've certainly seen some lower cholesterols. I haven't. I've often said that they probably need to increase that, but usually they've been kind of muddled by the fact that still temperature and pulse has been low, and hypothetically they probably needed more. And I think sometimes the cholesterol will take time to pick up again, particularly if it's been being used at a larger rate. It's not just the thyroid that's obviously an increase in thyroid that's going to drop that down if they're taking too much thyroid, but it may take time for kind of liver function, cholesterol production just to normalize. So I think in the short term, I wouldn't be worried about it. If it was longer term and it was associated with higher temperatures and pulses, you could probably back off that.
And then what is your thyroid supplement of choice? Like, what's the most easily available thing there for yourself?
Well, I Cyno Plus and Cynomel is still my choice, and I went to order some yesterday, and I showed you how computer illiterate and technology illiterate. I signed up for a blockchain account and managed to lock myself out straight away and lose my funds. And so I went to order some, and I couldn't get any, but there was plenty in stock, so I still have enough to last me for another 6 months. So I'm not too worried just yet.
Hey,
but
meds.com.mx, they just a few days ago said, hey, we have Cynoplus and Cynomel. And as far as I know, you only need to wire transfer the money. You don't need to use, because you were trying to get like a Bitcoin, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't think you have to send meds.com.mx Bitcoin. I think you can wire money to them.
Right. Okay. That's good to know. I was trying to, it was a bad day yesterday. But I also kind of lean heavily on Georgie supplements for clients, Tyromix, Tyronine. I think there were some issues at some point with the Tyromax, but I think they've resolved themselves now.
The one thing I've consistently seen, especially with that T3, is the dose is very big. It's like 8 micrograms per drop. And so I think Georgie is doing that for liability reasons, because there's another company that has an 8 microgram product. But I wish it was like 1 microgram per drop, because that would make life so much easier. Because I think for a sensitive person, and they take 8 micrograms in a liquid and it absorbs like instantaneously, it might make them really be sensitized to adrenaline, and they might feel really bad doing that.
Yeah, but I've had a hypothetical older client who's been taking that, and she's been tolerating that really well and needs to up the dose. So I think, again, going back to each person and their particular sensitivity. But yeah, even if it was half of that, right, would be better. Because obviously I do think some people can be sensitive, and titrating very, very slow and carefully can avoid that generally. I've rarely had the high adrenaline with clients. I think I told you last time that I did have a client once who just totally ignored what I said, and she took a bottle of Tyromix and nailed it within a week. She was like taking 10 grains a day from nothing to 10. And she got that hyper, like she goes, I think my heart rate's increasing. I said, what is it? She goes, 150 beats a minute. And I said, how much have you taken? I said, 3 drops. She said, oh, I thought you said 3 squirts. And and she was gone. And to be honest, she followed the advice, got her to slow down, and it was kind of back down within to under 90 within 3 days. So a young, healthy girl at 30, 32, 33, a hypothetical girl. And she kind of dealt with that very, very, very quickly. I mean, and I think that just kind of irons out the fact that you need to be in a fragile system for it to have very negative effects, and you need to go in with a higher dose. But generally, as a rule of thumb, it's very, very manageable. It's very, very safe. And I think you're probably safer than going in with most meds sometimes that tend to have a plethora of side effects.
Okay, let's get to some of these minutes. 50 minutes. Let's get to some of these super chats, because I think they cover some topics that I was going to ask you. Okay, can explain why T4 subs can be, this was from Javier, explain why T4 subs can be tough on the liver. Could taking too much T4 increase prolactin? Is a lower dose of T4 a viable way to lower prolactin?
Well, I think, and there was a study that came out, I think 2020, that showed that long-term levothyroxine users were kind of more prone to fibrosis, and it can have an effect on via a receptor, which I think was the integrin VB receptor that kind of interacts with F-actin and creates this kind of fibrotic state. But I think that's just generally that the rule is that an excess of T4, if your liver can't handle it, will kind of have to deal with degrading it, right? And it's like anything that's in excess. So this is why I still think having adequate T4 and T3 is useful. It's probably the reason why a lot of levothyroxine users don't report or tend to have less positive effects sometimes than kind of say NDT or kind of dual therapy. So I think it's to answer the question, I think it could be a problem if it was taken on its own. Though to be fair, you get some people who take levothyroxine and say they're absolutely fine. Yeah. But again, sometimes you could be applying that to you get a bunch of people going through the medical system who are given T4. And from where they were, it's almost like night and day. But then, what's the long term? Are they dealing with it well? Is the kind of liver processing it? Are they kind of lending to fibrosis? What's their diet like? I mean, all these things, again, that you need to consider.
Yeah, I did see a paper, maybe talking about ACTH and prolactin, and that just the T4 alone suppressed it, at least acutely. And so, of course, that'd make a person feel better. If they're suppressing their pituitary, they'll probably feel like $1 million, at least for a little while. and then the accumulation might cause a lot of problems.
Yeah, I mean, TRH will generally sensitized to prolactin anyway, the pituitary to produce more prolactin. So cutting back on the hypothalamic production of TRH will be, I think, a bonus, and it kind of lends itself back to Ray's old ideas about kind of removing the pituitary. And I think just generally keeping growth hormone and prolactin relatively lower are going to be beneficial for most people.
Good old W.D. Denkla and A.V. Everett.
That's it, right? Yeah, yeah.
Okay, you're the only person that would know that. Okay, so let's go to Ash, and he says, how does Ramadan fasting affect thyroid health, especially women who have underactive thyroid hypothyroidism? Tips to counteract the negative effects. Thank you.
Well, certainly there's some literature in some Muslim countries where they've kind of looked at that, and the recommendation is that those on medication, pregnant females and children should not be fasting, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm working with a client in the Middle East at the moment who doesn't fast because it's made her very sick in the past, and potentially there's an underactive thyroid that we're kind of working through, and I think that makes sense because obviously we know that fasting will suppress T3. It's interesting because some of the adaptations that you see in comparative literature, fasting and kind of cold exposure are kind of lumped in with the same effects of PTSD and long-term stressors. So I still think it's the idea that can you fast? Yes. Should you fast? Well, I think if you're prone to overeating, fasting might be a good strategy because it just gives you a system to work to. But generally, as a rule of thumb, autophagy, mitochondrial biogenesis are kind of maintained best when your thyroid works efficiently. And I think generally those who kind of function well when they've kind of fasted are probably more the people that are prone to overeating. And I don't think necessarily you're going to see all these centenarians. If you interview most centenarians, they're not probably going to have listed CrossFit, fasting, cold water baths in their kind of health and fitness regime.
How do you know that, Keith?
I'm just a guess. Just a guess.
Okay. Hage Gun 48 just sent us $5. Thank you so much. This is a joke. Ask Keith, is Tomo and his B requirement. Just don't even worry about that one. Okay.
What was that?
I do. It's like an inside joke or something. I don't know.
Okay.
Hogun48 sends us another $10 and say, what if you wake up with a temperature of 97 to 97.3 and pulse of 75 in the morning, but for most of the day, you're 98.6 to 98.8 and the pulse is 85 for most of the day?
I don't think that's necessarily going to be a bad thing.
But, okay, so they're waking up with a little bit of a lower temperature and pulse rate, but couldn't. So I'm sure you've experienced this. I have talked to lots of people that had lots of obvious stress manifestation symptoms, and they'll be like, I measured my temperature. It was over 98.6. It was over 37. And then their pulse is like 85 to 90. And so what would you think of in that situation?
Well, it depends. Again, it's really, it depends kind of thing. I think, people, I've also got no problem with pulse being 85 to 90. And if they're feeling good, that's okay.
But couldn't that be a sign that their adrenaline and cortisol is like through the roof?
Yeah, it could be.
Mm-hmm.
It really does depend on the person. Is it associated with negative symptoms though? Or how are they feeling? Do they feel relatively organized, able to grasp the day, focus on tasks, feel good? So I think it depends on what the symptoms that someone's experiencing. Could it be associated with increased adrenaline and cortisol? Yes, or but again, you'd need to ask the person directly how they feel with that. I've got no problem with people sitting slightly over 37 or 98.6, but I think still the general window of 36 and a half or 97.8 on waking to 98.6 or 37 after a feed. I think if the pulse was kind of coming in the lower 60s, then I'd probably want to maybe address that. And I think if the temperature, it's slightly outside, and again, without knowing the function of the person, it's difficult to say whether it's negative or not. But again, I think striving for the 97.8 might be something to work on. But again, if they're kind of responding with this, what might be perceived as a high adrenaline, high cortisol, what's the diet like? All the usual suspects we would be considering.
I feel you. But when you're saying, hey, I'm comfortable with the higher temperature or the higher pulse rate, that usually is when a person is taking thyroid, right? Like if a person's not taking thyroid and they just have a really high pulse rate and temperature, it's like usually they're not going to have, and they have symptoms, they're not going to be like high thyroid people, right?
Yeah. So if it is the adrenaline that's the issue, then, I think you'd be working on your kind of adrenaline lowering responses. But again, how's their diet with that? How can you, it's difficult to tell what's going on. Are you just saying that the temperature and the pulse rate are slightly elevated?
I was reading this. Did you ask me? Can you ask me that again?
No, I was just saying that you'd have to look at the diet and everything to understand what's going on with the person. Because if you're saying the temperature's running higher, I mean, I find it a really difficult question to ask without knowing everything that the person has going for them.
Fair enough. I feel you. I wanted to ask you about what do you feel about Ray's kind of final protein revelation? I don't know why, but I've been thinking about this a lot. Like that. I thought it was very uncharacteristic. I mean, I've said this before. I thought it was uncharacteristic. I thought it fit technically within his whole schematic that he's been working on for a long time. And he's obviously been very anti-methionine, cysteine, and tryptophan for, I think he wrote that article in 2006, so it's not a new thing. But even, I don't know if you heard our last live stream with him, but I was framing it like, hey, you changed your mind. You're saying under 50 grams is like this thing that can be useful when I've never heard that before. And to him, it seemed like I was framing it completely incorrectly. And to him, it was like within the normal scope of how he viewed things. And so, and I kind of think like before Ray passed, that's like the last kind of like revelatory thing that he was working on was the protein. And it makes me think about cysteine and methionine and tryptophan in a way that I hadn't previously. Like, oh, maybe these were like way more important to lower than I had ever thought about, because he before he died, this was like really important to him. And so maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill, but I was just curious if you had any thoughts on it.
Well, it's one of those things, isn't it? I think he probably went too low with protein. Maybe that would have been could have gone negatively against him. I mean, difficult to say, right? It's again the guy was 86. He was still 8 years older than the average person who passes in the US. I never expected him to kind of live on to be this like Jean Calment or anyone like that. He was somebody who was practical. He probably came to his kind of other ideas later on in life. So he might have reached his actual true genetic potential. And there are so many other things to consider with that. So I think he still did really well, but I think he probably went too low with protein. I think still methionine and cysteine are still essential to life. I think there's probably a sweet spot there. But I don't know what he was kind of trying. I mean, it's sort of like saying what we're saying here is was that really important for his kind of where he was physiologically at the time? And I think he tried going slightly lower protein. Did he not go back up with it though?
I'm really sketchy on the details. From our interview with him, it sounded like he couldn't get it any lower than 50. Like he'd go even lower, but like grape juice had more protein that he thought it would, or something. Like it was hard to just get enough food without getting 50 grams of protein or so.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think potentially looking, I mean, I think it's that sweet spot. We know that methionine and cysteine can have quite negative effects, and tryptophan, right? So I think that there is a sweet spot, and maybe that's individual for each person. Maybe kind of daily exercise needs is also a part of that. Could, maybe looking at maintaining strength and muscle mass would have been exceptionally important as well. And with that, you do require a certain amount of the amino acids. And I think being subjective about that within disease states as an older person, it becomes really difficult to answer. I think it becomes very subjective again. But again, what are the exact amounts of those? I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I think about it so much because maybe in 2020, I was like, Ray, if you hypothetically were going to eat some beef, would you balance it with calcium? Would you drink coffee? Or would you balance it with gelatin? And he said his first thing he would do is balance it with calcium, then drink coffee, and then gelatin. And so that's like the least important thing. And so I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then later, so again, I don't want to speculate too much, but I find it to be kind of fascinating. That was one of the last things that he was really into. And maybe if he could do it over again, he would have spent more time going low protein. I have no idea. We can't ask him, but
yeah, I mean, potentially you could, like I said, could have gone too low. I mean, the last experiment, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting one.
Okay. You have to go soon. So, in like 3 minutes. Okay. Maybe I should just cut it here. Let everybody know where they can find you on the internet. Shout out your, here's your website, balancedbodymind.com.
Body Mind, that's it.
And then Tomo Littlewood, the Instagram, and you are prolific on there. So much great information. What else?
That's it, really. I try not to spread myself too much. I don't have much else to say. I just so busy with things as usual, juggling everything. So that's generally where I'm at. I have started doing a bit more on Twitter, but I find it quite dull going into Twitter and seeing all those opinions everywhere. And I just kind of, I usually say something, nobody responds to it, and then I just shut it down for a week or so, and then go, maybe I should try again. And then I go, no, I can't be bothered.
Yeah, you have to have like the thickest skin ever to navigate on Twitter frequently, because you'll find stuff you don't like about yourself pretty often. But hey, Keith, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. I changed the time on you for this, and you were a sport about it, so I really appreciate you. Again, have a great holiday with your family, Christmas, whatever you celebrate.
Yeah, well, good luck with your chickens. They require a lot of TLC and looking after. So it's like I said, it's like having your own family.
Appreciate it, brother. Stay on the line. Hey, all the viewers, thank you guys so much. We have another Generative Energy with Nick Stumphauser at 6 p.m. So that should be really fun. And that's going to be on Rumble. And so I'll send the link on my Telegram if you're interested in watching that. Keith, thank you so much. Really appreciate you. You're a genius. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the viewers of this show. And we'll see you guys later at 6 p.m. tonight. Okay. Bye, everyone.